Hi, I'm Ryan, and in a room filled with my father's most important business partners, my own mother looked me in the eye and said, "You bring shame to this family." It's a moment that freezes in time, a single sentence that can shatter a person's world. The sound of her voice, sharp and clear, cut through the low murmur of conversation, and for a second I couldn't breathe. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of that opulent living room. Have you ever felt the sting of words from someone who was supposed to love you unconditionally? Before. I'd tell you what happened right after she said that. The moment that silenced the entire room for a completely different reason. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss how that dinner party ended. This wasn't a new feeling, just a new level of public execution. My family operates on a different frequency, one tuned to stock portfolios, social standing, and the pristine image of success. Our family home in Greenwich, Connecticut, wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of their values, a sprawling estate with manicured lawns and polished marble floors that always seemed to reflect my own shortcomings back at me. My father, William, was a titan of industry who measured a man's worth by the make of his car and the balance in his offshore accounts. My sister, Claire, was his perfect heir, a carbon copy of my mother's social ambitions, who had done everything right from her Ivy League degree to her picture-perfect marriage. And then there was me, the perpetual disappointment. My mother, Helen, was the gatekeeper of this world. Her approval was a currency I had long since stopped trying to earn. Her disappointment wasn't usually so direct. It was typically delivered in subtle jabs, a sigh when I mentioned my job, or a carefully worded question about when I was going to get serious about my life. I remember one Christmas, she'd given me a generic store-bought sweater, while Claire received a vintage Cartier watch that had been in the family for generations. The message was clear. One of us was a part of the legacy and the other was just a guest. Her words at the dinner party were just the culmination of years of quiet dismissals. The final, public declaration of what I'd always been made to feel in private. To make matters worse, there was Ethan, my sister's husband. In my family's eyes, Ethan could do no wrong. He was the son my father never had, ambitious, charismatic, and successful in a field they could understand and brag about. They spoke of him in reverent tones, recounting his business achievements at every opportunity. His presence at family gatherings only magnified my own perceived failures. He was their shining example of what a man should be, and his light cast a long dark shadow that I was constantly trying to escape. They saw him as the pinnacle of success, the perfect addition to the family dynasty, while I was seen as a glitch in the otherwise flawless family portrait they so carefully curated. The dinner party was my father's annual tradition, a command performance for his inner circle. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of powerful men discussing deals. I stood by the grand fireplace, watching the waiters in crisp white jackets move silently through the crowd with trays of champagne. I felt like an imposter, a piece of furniture that didn't match the rest of the decor. The whole scene was a testament to their world. The heavy crystal glasses, the original artwork on the walls, the view of the Long Island Sound from the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was all designed to impress, to project an image of effortless power and old money, an image I had never fit into. The breaking point came when one of my father's partners, a man with a booming voice and a Rolex that probably cost more than my car, turned to me and asked what I did for a living. I gave him a simple, honest answer, without embellishment. I saw my mother's jaw tighten from across the room. She excused herself from her conversation, walked directly over to me, and that's when she said it. "You bring shame to this family." She didn't whisper it. She said it loud enough for the small circle of people around us to hear. The conversation stopped. The man with the Rolex looked down at his shoes. A wave of heat washed over my face, the kind of deep burning humiliation that you feel in your bones. But in that moment of searing shame, something inside me shifted. Instead of the usual flare of anger or the familiar sting of hurt, a strange, cold calm settled over me. I looked at my mother's perfectly composed face, her expression a mask of cold disdain, and I realized this was it. This was the last time her words would have the power to break me. I didn't say anything back. I didn't defend myself. I just gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. I decided then and there that I would endure the rest of the evening, play the part of the dutiful son, because I knew a truth they didn't. My validation didn't live in this house anymore. I glanced over at my father. He hadn't missed a beat. He was already steering his business partner away, smoothing things over with a practiced laugh, more concerned with the social disruption than the cruelty of his wife's words. He shot me a look of pure annoyance, as if my very existence was an inconvenience he had to manage. My sister, Claire, who had been standing nearby, simply turned her back, a silent affirmation of our mother's judgment. In that moment, surrounded by family, I had never felt more alone. The isolation was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical barrier, as real and as solid as the walls of that house. The dinner bell chimed and everyone began to move toward the dining room. I followed a ghost at my own family's feast. I sat at the long, polished table, watching as the first course was served. The tension was palpable, a silent current running beneath the renewed chatter. People avoided my gaze and the conversation around me felt forced and brittle. But I wasn't really there anymore. I was just waiting. We were all waiting for one more guest to arrive. The guest of honor they were all so eager to impress, my brother-in-law Ethan. His flight had been delayed, but he was expected any minute. And I knew his arrival would change everything. The walk to the dining room felt like a mile. Each step was heavy, deliberate, as if I were wading through thick mud. The chatter resumed around me, a brittle, forced sound that didn't quite cover the gaping hole my mother's words had torn in the evening's fabric. I took my assigned seat, the one always placed at the far end of the table, a geographical representation of my place in the family hierarchy. The heavy silverware felt cold and alien in my hands. The crystal water glass shimmered under the chandelier, and for a moment I saw a distorted reflection of my own face, a stranger at a banquet. The servers placed a plate of delicately arranged seafood before me, but I knew it would taste like cardboard. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a hollow ache that spread from my chest outward. This was a familiar ache, a ghost I'd lived with for years. I remembered my college graduation. I had chosen a path in public service, something I was genuinely passionate about, but it wasn't finance or corporate law. When I told my father, he just nodded slowly, a deep disappointment settling in his eyes. "Well, son," he'd said, clapping a hand on my shoulder with a weight that felt more like an anchor, "everyone needs a hobby." He said it at my graduation party, in front of friends and relatives, turning my 4 years of hard work into a whimsical pastime. My degree, my accomplishment, was reduced to a footnote in the grand narrative of the family's success. Tonight was just a louder, more public version of that same dismissal. The wound wasn't new. It had just been ripped open again for everyone to see. My father, now at the head of the table, was in his element. He was a master of social recovery, effortlessly steering the conversation away from the unpleasantness and back toward business. He laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that commanded attention, and launched into a story about a recent acquisition. He never once looked in my direction. It was his signature move, strategic ignorance. If he didn't acknowledge my pain, my humiliation, then it simply didn't exist in his world. He even made a veiled jab, raising his glass to toast, to those who march to the beat of their own drum. "Even if it leads them off a cliff." A few of his partners chuckled politely. It was a joke, of course, but the punchline was my life. Across the table, my sister Claire refused to meet my eyes. She stared intently at her plate, pushing a scallop around with her fork. I could see the faint blush of embarrassment on her cheeks. She was ashamed, not for what our mother had done, but of me, of the scene I had apparently caused simply by existing. I remembered building forts with her in the backyard of this very house, a lifetime ago. We were allies then, a team against the world, but that girl was gone, replaced by a woman who had so fully bought into our parents' value system that she couldn't even offer a sympathetic glance. Her silence was a betrayal far deeper than my mother's words, a quiet severing of the last bond I thought we had. The conversation naturally drifted to the person everyone was truly waiting for. Ethan. "Has anyone heard from Ethan?" one of the guests asked my father. William's face lit up instantly. He texted just before we sat down. "Landed safely. He's on his way. You know, he just closed that massive tech merger in California. The man's a genius." An absolute shock. The pride in his voice was a physical thing, thick and suffocating. I had to sit there invisible at the end of the table and listen to the litany of my brother-in-law's triumphs. Each word of praise was another shovel of dirt on the coffin of my own worth in their eyes. He was the son my father had always wanted, and I was just the placeholder. My mother, meanwhile, played the part of the impeccable hostess. She smiled serenely, directing the servers with a flick of her wrist, ensuring every glass remained full. She looked down the table at me once, her expression unreadable but for a flicker of something hard and unyielding in her eyes. There was no regret there. It was a look of grim satisfaction, as if she had performed a necessary, albeit unpleasant, duty. She had excised the imperfection from her perfect evening. In her mind, she hadn't been cruel. She had been protecting the family's image, a cause for which any sacrifice, including her own son's dignity, was apparently justified. Her composure was chilling, a testament to a lifetime spent prioritizing appearances over affection. A woman sitting next to me, the wife of one of my father's colleagues, made a valiant attempt at kindness. She turned to me with a polite smile. "And what is it you do, Ryan? Your father is always so busy talking about Ethan's work. We never hear about you." Before I could even form a response, my mother's voice cut across the table, smooth as silk and sharp as glass. "Ryan is finding his path," she said, not looking at me. "He's taking some time for himself." The condescension was breathtaking. She had reduced my career, my life's work, into a prolonged gap year, a childish indulgence. The woman gave me a pitying look and quickly turned away. The conversation effectively shut down. I was once again relegated to the shadows. I looked around at the opulent dining room, at the heavy silk curtains and the ancestral portraits staring down from the walls. This was the world I was born into, but it had never felt like mine. It was a kingdom of numbers, of stock tickers and market caps, of judging a person's value by the brand of their watch or the size of their portfolio. My own ambitions felt small and insignificant in this grand theatre of wealth. I had chosen a life of service and discipline, things that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. To them, my choice wasn't just different. It was a deliberate rejection of everything they stood for, an insult to the dynasty my father had built. For a fleeting second, a raw, primal anger surged through me. I wanted to stand up, to shatter the calm facade of this dinner party. I wanted to tell them what real value was, what real honor meant. I pictured the shock on their faces, the satisfying chaos of it all. But then another voice, a quieter and more disciplined one I had learned far from this place, took over. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second and took a deep, steadying breath. I focused on the weight of the chair beneath me, the cool condensation on my water glass. My composure was the only thing I truly owned in this room, and I would not let them take it from me. This was not the battlefield I had trained for. The talk of Ethan's imminent arrival grew more frequent. "He should be pulling into the driveway any minute now," Claire said, a genuine smile finally gracing her lips. The anticipation was palpable. They were all waiting for their hero to arrive, the conquering son-in-law who would validate their entire worldview. For them, his presence was the final, perfect touch to the evening. For me, it was the beginning of the end. I knew what was coming. The tension in the room was a taut wire of social expectation, but the tension in my own chest was something else entirely, the calm before a storm that only I could see on the horizon. Just as the servers began clearing the main course plates, the doorbell rang. Its chime cut through the low hum of conversation, sharp and clear. A sudden silence fell over the table. Every single person, from my father at the head to the guests along the sides, turned their heads toward the grand entryway. A slow smile spread across my father's face. "Right on time," he said, his voice booming with satisfaction as he started to push his chair back. "That'll be him." I didn't move. I simply picked up my water glass, brought it to my lips, and took a long, slow drink. The pounding in my chest was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat. The guest of honor had arrived. The heavy oak door swung open, and our butler, a man who had been with the family for decades and had seen it all, stood formally in the entryway. My father was halfway out of his seat, a broad, welcoming smile already plastered on his face, ready to greet the man he considered his true successor. The guests craned their necks, their faces a mixture of curiosity and reverence. They were all eager to get a look at the legendary Ethan, the man whose name had been spoken like a prayer all evening. But the person standing on the porch wasn't Ethan. It was a young man in a courier's uniform, holding a large, ostentatious bouquet of orchids. The collective energy in the room seemed to deflate with a soft hiss, a balloon of anticipation pricked by a small pin of anticlimax. The courier stepped forward and announced the flowers were for my mother, a pre-arrival gift from Ethan, with a note apologizing for his delay. My mother accepted them with a theatrical sigh of adoration, her eyes sweeping the room to make sure everyone had witnessed this grand gesture. "Isn't he just the most thoughtful man?" she murmured to the woman beside her. The gesture was classic Ethan, a calculated display of consideration that also served as a reminder of his success and wealth. He couldn't even apologize without it being an event. My father chuckled, slapping the table lightly. "That's my boy," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Always one step ahead. The tension eased, replaced by a renewed round of admiration for the man who wasn't even there yet. As the butler arranged the orchids on a nearby console table, the conversation picked back up, now centered entirely on Ethan's thoughtfulness and my sister's good fortune. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, a silent, secret tremor against my leg. Under the cover of the tablecloth, I pulled it out. The screen lit up with a new message. It was from Ethan. My thumb hovered over the notification for a second, my heart giving a single hard thump against my ribs. I knew this was it. This was the signal. The words on the screen were simple, almost mundane, but to me they were the opening lines of the final act of a play only I had the script for. The rest of the room was watching a different show entirely. The message read, "Parking out back. Traffic was brutal. Give me 2 minutes to change. See you inside." That one word, a change, was everything. It wasn't about changing out of a travel-worn suit into a fresh one for dinner. It was about something else entirely. A cold, clear certainty washed over me, displacing the last remnants of humiliation from my mother's earlier attack. I wasn't just waiting for my brother-in-law anymore. I was waiting for an ally, for the arrival of a truth that would land in the middle of this polished dining room like a grenade. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, my movements slow and deliberate. I took a sip of water, the cool liquid a stark contrast to the fire that was beginning to burn in my gut. I looked up and caught my father's eye. He was frowning at me, a clear look of disapproval on his face for my breach of dinner party etiquette. Using a phone at his table was a cardinal sin, another mark against my name in his long ledger of my failures. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. He was judging me for a minor social infraction while being completely blind to the tidal wave that was about to crash over his perfectly orchestrated evening. I held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, letting a small, unreadable smile touch my lips before I looked away. Let him think what he wanted. His opinion, his judgment, his entire world, it was all about to become irrelevant. My sister Claire, oblivious, launched into a detailed account of her and Ethan's upcoming trip to Monaco for the Grand Prix. She spoke of the suite they had booked at the Hôtel de Paris, the parties on a Russian oligarch's yacht they were invited to, the custom gown she was having made. It was a performance for the guests, a verbal tapestry woven from threads of wealth and status. "Ethan says the view of the harbor from the suite is simply breathtaking," she said, her voice filled with a practiced nonchalance that was meant to signal that this level of luxury was just normal for her. Each detail was another brick in the wall that separated her world from mine, and she was cementing it with pride, blissfully unaware that the foundation was about to crumble. Suddenly, a different sound cut through the drone of conversation, the distinct, solid thud of a car door shutting, much closer this time. It was the sound of a heavy door, like one from an old-fashioned American-made vehicle, not the whisper-quiet click of a German luxury sedan. A few heads turned toward the windows. The low murmur of chatter faltered again. The butler, who had been standing discreetly by the wall, straightened his posture and began moving toward the grand entryway without a word. The air in the room grew heavy with anticipation once more. This time it felt different. This time it felt final. The small talk died completely, replaced by a thick, expectant silence that felt louder than any conversation. My father pushed his chair back again, slowly this time, his eyes fixed on the doorway. He placed his hands on the table, ready to rise, a king prepared to welcome his heir apparent. My mother subtly adjusted the neckline of her dress, her face a mask of serene, proud composure. They were a portrait of power and privilege, perfectly framed by the opulent, surroundings of their own making. They thought this was the triumphant climax of their evening, the moment their prize son-in-law would arrive and validate everything they believed in. They had no idea they were just actors on a stage. And the main character was about to walk on and rewrite the entire script. The front door opened, and for a second all I could see was a silhouette against the dark evening sky. It was a man's figure, tall and broad-shouldered, but the shape was wrong. It wasn't the soft, elegant cut of a Tom Ford suit they were all expecting. The lines were sharper, more severe. There was a rigid formality to the posture that was utterly alien to this room of relaxed, powerful men. A wave of confusion rippled through the guests. I heard someone whisper, "Who is that?" My father's welcoming smile faltered, replaced by a look of complete bewilderment. He remained frozen, halfway between sitting and standing, unable to process what he was seeing. Then, he stepped fully into the light of the chandelier, and the room fell into a state of absolute stunned silence. It was Ethan, but it was an Ethan none of them had ever seen before. He was wearing the deep blue formal dress uniform of a United States Army officer. The jacket was adorned with ribbons, the trousers were perfectly creased, and on his shoulders were the silver oak leaf insignias of a major. His face was a stoic, unsmiling mask. His eyes, serious and focused, scanned the room, passing over my shocked father, my speechless mother, and my pale-faced sister. He ignored them all, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the guests until it finally landed on me, at the far end of the table. In that single, breathless moment, the entire universe of my family's making seemed to grind to a halt. The air, once filled with the confident murmur of wealth and influence, became a vacuum of pure, unadulterated shock. My father's hand, which had been reaching for his wine glass, froze in mid-air. My mother's perfectly practiced hostess smile dissolved, leaving her features slack with disbelief. Claire's face went white, her eyes wide as she stared at her husband, not with recognition but with the dawning horror of seeing a complete stranger. It wasn't just the uniform, it was the man wearing it. The affable, charismatic dealmaker they all adored was gone, replaced by a figure of rigid, unyielding authority who seemed to have been carved from stone. This wasn't a costume, it was a statement. Ethan didn't offer a smile or a word of greeting. His movements were economical and precise, utterly devoid of the easygoing charm he usually employed to navigate these social gatherings. He walked past the priceless art, his polished black dress shoes making sharp rhythmic clicks on the marble floor that echoed in the profound silence. Each step was a deliberate, measured beat, a drum roll counting down to a moment they couldn't possibly comprehend. He ignored the stunned faces of my father's partners, men he usually went out of his way to impress. He ignored my father's half-risen, bewildered form. He even ignored his own wife, who looked as if she might faint. His gaze cut a straight line through the opulent room, a laser beam that locked onto its one and only target, me. My father was the first to start processing the scene, but his mind, so adept at calculating stock prices and market trends, couldn't make sense of this data. A flicker of anger crossed his face, the kind he reserved for employees who made a costly mistake. He clearly thought this was some kind of elaborate, tasteless joke. "Ethan," he said, his voice a low, confused growl. "What in God's name are you wearing? Did you lose a bet?" The question hung in the air, a pathetic attempt to impose his own reality on a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of his control. He was trying to frame it as a foolish prank, a momentary lapse in judgment from his golden boy, because the alternative was simply unthinkable. He looked at me, a flash of suspicion in his eyes, as if I were somehow the architect of this bizarre spectacle. My mother, for her part, looked utterly betrayed. Her face, a carefully constructed mask of social grace, had completely crumbled. This was a disruption of the highest order, an assault on the perfect image she had spent a lifetime curating. This wasn't part of the script. Her prized son-in-law, the man who was supposed to be the jewel in her family's crown, had just walked into her home dressed for a parade, not a dinner party with the city's elite. Her eyes darted between Ethan and Claire, a silent, frantic question in her gaze. Claire just shook her head slightly, her expression one of pure, helpless confusion. She was looking at the man she married, the man she thought she knew, and realizing in front of a room full of people that she might not know him at all. As Ethan continued his steady advance toward my end of the table, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie of my own life. The burning humiliation from my mother's words had cooled into a solid core of resolve in my stomach. This was it. This was the moment of truth I had been preparing for, not just for tonight, but for years. I didn't feel triumph or a petty desire for revenge. I just felt a profound sense of clarity. For my entire life, I had been an equation they couldn't solve, a variable that didn't fit their formula for success. But my life wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a reality they had simply refused to see, and now that reality was marching right toward them. The guests were completely still, a tableau of frozen disbelief. Forks were suspended halfway to mouths. Wine glasses were held motionless. Their eyes shifted back and forth between Ethan, my father, and me, trying to piece together the narrative. They had come here tonight for a predictable evening of fine dining and networking, a reinforcement of their own comfortable world order. Instead, they had been given a front-row seat to the implosion of the very family they were there to court. The subtle power dynamics of the room had been shattered. Suddenly, the man with the most expensive watch and the biggest business deal no longer held the most power. The power was now with the man in the uniform, and no one knew why. I remembered a conversation with my father years ago when I was trying to decide what to do after college. I had tentatively brought up the idea of military service. He had laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "Son, that's a noble calling for other people's sons," he had said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Our family serves in a different way. We build things. We create wealth. We lead." In his world, honor was measured in dollars, and sacrifice was a line item on a tax return. He couldn't conceive of a currency like duty, or a commitment that didn't come with a stock option. Keeping my career a secret wasn't just about avoiding his disapproval. It was about protecting something he and my mother would never be able to understand, let alone value. Ethan finally came to a stop. He positioned himself a few feet from the end of the table, in the open space between the last guest and me. He stood perfectly erect, his back ramrod straight, his hands held rigidly at his sides. The silence in the room was now so absolute that I could hear the faint, nervous breathing of the woman sitting next to me. The air was thick with unspoken questions. With a tension so palpable, it felt like a physical force pressing down on all of us. He hadn't said a word, but his presence had completely commandeered the room. He was no longer Ethan, the successful tech mogul. He was an officer of the United States Army, and he was on duty. His eyes met mine across the short distance. In them I saw no theatrics, no malice, just a quiet, unwavering respect. It was a look that communicated everything we had discussed in secret, every late-night phone call where he listened to my frustrations, every promise he had made to stand with me when the time was right. Claire had married a good man, a better man than any of them deserved. He understood a different kind of code, a bond that had been forged not in a boardroom, but in shared principles of honor and service. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, a final confirmation. The plan was in motion. The truth was here. Just as the silence reached its breaking point, my father finally found his voice again. He stood up fully, his face red with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He pointed a trembling finger at Ethan. "Ethan, I am not going to ask you again," he boomed, his voice straining to reclaim its lost authority. "Take off that ridiculous costume and explain yourself this instant." His command was loud, imperious, the desperate roar of a king whose authority was being openly defied in his own court. But his words were swallowed by the space between them, because Ethan wasn't looking at him. He wasn't listening. His entire being was focused on me, and as my father's demand echoed unanswered, Ethan's right hand began to move. With a precision that was terrifying in its foreignness to this room, Ethan's right hand didn't just rise, it sliced through the air. It wasn't a wave or a casual gesture. It was a single fluid motion, an arc of disciplined energy that started at his side and ended with a sharp, definitive snap. His elbow locked, his fingers perfectly straight and together. In the same instant, his heels clicked together on the marble floor, a sound so sharp and clean it was like a whip crack in the dead silence. My father's angry words died in his throat, choked off by a display of formality so absolute, so out of place in his world of casual power, that his mind simply could not process it. He just stared, his mouth slightly open, a man witnessing a ritual from a completely different planet. His hand met the brim of his perfectly positioned service cap, his gaze locked on mine with an intensity that seemed to burn away everything else in the room. The air solidified. Time seemed to slow down, stretching the moment into an eternity. He stood there, a statue of deference and respect, his entire being focused on me. The guests, my family, the very house itself, it all faded into a blurry periphery. In the center of this universe was his unwavering salute, a gesture of honor so profound and unshakable that it physically altered the gravity in the room. It was a silent, powerful declaration that negated every insult, every dismissal, every single moment of humiliation I had ever endured under this roof. It was the truth made visible and undeniable. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, resonant, and carried the unmistakable weight of command. It cut through the suffocating silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Major, sir." 2 simple words. Not Ryan, not brother. He used my rank, a title none of them even knew I possessed, and followed it with a term of respect so formal, so ingrained in a world of duty and sacrifice, that it sounded like a foreign language in this dining room. Those 2 words landed in the center of the table and detonated, shattering the fragile glass of my family's carefully constructed reality. The shame my mother had tried to place on my shoulders was vaporized in an instant, replaced by an honor they could never bestow and would never understand. I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. A lifetime of feeling invisible had just ended, not with a bang, but with a quiet, solid click of understanding. I met his gaze, and in that moment, we were the only 2 people in the room who understood the real rules. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. It was an acknowledgement. An acceptance. It was me, finally and completely, stepping into the truth of who I was, right in the heart of the place that had tried so hard to deny it. My validation wasn't a plea anymore. It was a fact reported for duty. The calm I had felt earlier solidified into something unbreakable, a foundation forged in places they couldn't imagine. That's when the fork fell. The sound was almost comical in its delicacy, a tiny clatter of silver on polished marble that echoed like a gunshot in the stunned silence. I glanced at my father. The fork had slipped from his limp fingers. His face, which moments before had been a mask of red-faced fury, was now completely slack. The color had drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty grey pallor. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on Ethan, but it was as if he wasn't seeing him anymore. He was seeing the complete and utter demolition of his own worldview. The man he had praised, the shark he had lauded as his true successor, was standing at attention for the son he had dismissed as a failure. The system had broken. The numbers no longer added up. My mother's reaction was even more profound. Her hand flew to her mouth, but it was a clumsy, uncoordinated gesture, not her usual display of practiced elegance. A small strangled gasp escaped her lips. The impeccable hostess, the queen of this social chessboard, had been checkmated. Her face was a canvas of raw, unfiltered shock and dawning horror. This wasn't just an embarrassment. It was a public unraveling. The shame she had so callously thrown at me had ricocheted back with devastating force, exposing the foundation of her world, image, status, perception, as nothing more than a house of cards. She looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time all night, and in her eyes I saw not anger but a terrifying, bottomless confusion. Across the table, Claire looked as if she'd seen a ghost. Her face was ashen, her lipstick a garish slash of color against her pale skin. She was staring at her husband, the man whose business trips she bragged about, whose success was the bedrock of her own identity. But the man in the uniform was a stranger. This wasn't the charismatic entrepreneur who charmed investors. This was someone else entirely, a man who belonged to a different world, a world with a code of conduct she couldn't comprehend. Her eyes darted from Ethan to me, and I could see the frantic calculations behind them, the desperate attempt to reconcile the man she married with the soldier, standing before her, saluting the brother she had always looked down on. Her perfect life had just revealed a secret compartment she never knew existed. The guests were frozen, a gallery of wax figures. The man with the Rolex had his wine glass paused halfway to his lips, his mouth slightly agape. The woman who had offered me her pity now stared at me with wide, unreadable eyes. They were all silent witnesses to a tectonic shift in power. Their world was governed by wealth, by market shares and political connections. But what they were seeing now was a different kind of power, one that had nothing to do with money. It was the power of earned respect, of a hierarchy forged not in boardrooms but in sacrifice. They were watching the carefully curated narrative of the great William Thompson family fall apart in real time, and they couldn't look away. Ethan held the salute. He didn't waver. His arm remained locked, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on me. He held it for a second, then 2, then 5. It was an uncomfortably long time, a deliberate act that forced everyone in the room to sit with this new reality. He was pinning them to their seats with the sheer force of his discipline. He was making it clear that this was not a joke, not a performance. This was a formal rendering of respect from one officer to a superior. In those excruciatingly long seconds, he wasn't Claire's husband or my father's protégé. He was a soldier, and he was acknowledging his commanding officer. He was holding the moment until I and only I released him from it. Finally, I broke the silence. My voice was quiet, steady, and carried an authority that had nothing to do with the volume at which it was spoken. It was the voice I used in a different part of my life, a part I had kept hidden from them for so long. "At ease, Ethan," I said. The words were simple, a standard command, but in that room they were a proclamation. It was an order, not a request, and it was directed at the man they all revered. It was the final, undeniable confirmation of the new hierarchy that had just been established. I was not the family disappointment. I was the one in command. With the same sharp precision he had used to initiate it, Ethan dropped his salute. His arm returned to his side in a single clean motion. He remained standing at attention, his posture still formal, but the intense direct connection between us was broken. The spell was lifted, but the magic, or rather the lack of it, was gone from the room forever. The air didn't return to normal. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a truth that could never be unsaid, a reality that could never be unseen. The dinner party was over. My old life in this house was over, and a new, terrifying and profoundly real one had just begun. Ethan stood there for another second, a statue of military formality in a room built on the shifting sands of social status. The only sound was the frantic, shallow breathing of my mother. I finally gave him another nod, a quiet dismissal. He relaxed his posture slightly, though he didn't move from his spot. The room was still frozen, every eye on me, waiting for my next move, my explanation, my reaction. They expected a speech, I think, a confrontation, some grand declaration. But the truth didn't need a monologue. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the marble floor with a sound that felt deafening. I folded my napkin, placed it beside my untouched plate, and stood up. I didn't look at my father, whose face was a mess of confusion and rage. I didn't look at my mother, who seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 seconds. I simply turned my back on the entire scene and walked away. The walk out of that dining room was the longest and shortest of my life. I passed the stunned faces of my father's business partners, men who had looked through me all night. Now they stared at me as if I were a ghost. I walked past my sister, who wouldn't meet my eyes, her gaze fixed on the pristine white tablecloth as if it held the answers to the universe. I passed the grand fireplace where my mother had delivered her verdict on my life, and I walked through the cavernous entryway. My hand closed around the cold brass of the front door handle. I didn't pause. I didn't look back. I just pulled the heavy door open, stepped out into the cool night air, and let it click shut behind me. The sound was final, a clean break. For the first time, leaving that house didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like a victory. Ethan told me later what happened after I left. The silence held for another full minute before one of the guests, a man my father desperately wanted to impress, cleared his throat and mumbled something about an early morning. That was the signal. Within 15 minutes, the house was empty. The perfectly arranged dinner party had dissolved into a panicked, awkward exodus. Then the real storm broke. Claire, he said, turned on him with a fury he'd never seen, accusing him of orchestrating the whole thing to humiliate her, to ruin her family. My father just stood there, speechless, looking back and forth between them. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about the lie their entire perfect life had been built on. The truth hadn't just set me free. It had imprisoned them in the ruins of their own making. The phone calls started the next morning. My father left a series of voicemails, each one escalating in tone. The first was a barked command, "Call me now." The second was laced with threats about my inheritance and responsibilities. The third was almost pleading, a confused and broken man asking, "What did you do, Ryan? What is all this?" My mother called only once. Her voice was thin, brittle. "We need to talk," she said, without any of her usual authority. "People are talking." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a question about my well-being. It was damage control. Her primary concern wasn't her son's hidden life of service, but the social fallout from its revelation. I listened to the messages and then deleted them. There was nothing left to say. The fallout was exactly what she feared. In a world like theirs, built on image and reputation, a story like that is poison. My father's carefully crafted persona of the all-powerful patriarch had been publicly fractured. The man who couldn't even control his own family dinner wasn't so intimidating in the boardroom the next Monday. Deals he thought were certain suddenly needed re-evaluation. His partners, who had witnessed the scene, now saw a weakness they could exploit. The whispers in their exclusive country club, the sideways glances at charity galas. It was a death by 1,000 cuts for a man whose entire identity was built on the perception of others. He had spent his life building a fortress of wealth, only to find out the foundations were made of glass. A few weeks later, Claire asked to meet. We sat in a sterile, anonymous coffee shop, halfway between her world and mine. She looked exhausted. The designer clothes and perfect hair were there, but the confidence was gone. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, stirring a coffee she never drank. "Ethan is talking about leaving. He says he can't live like this anymore." It was all about her, how my secret had upended her life, threatened her social standing, fractured her marriage. There was no acknowledgement of the years of dismissal, no apology for her silence that night. I just listened. When she was done, I paid for the coffees and stood up. "I have to go, Claire," I said. It was the last time we ever spoke alone. Life for me, on the other hand, became simpler. A tremendous weight had been lifted, a burden I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying. The need to compartmentalize my life, to hide a fundamental part of who I was gone. My work became my whole world, not just a secret part of it. The respect I got from my team, the sense of purpose in our missions, it felt more real, more solid than anything my family's money could ever buy. The silence from Greenwich was no longer a painful void. It was a peaceful quiet. I'd spent so many years feeling like a satellite in a distant, cold orbit around their sun. Now I realized I was my own star, and I was finally generating my own light and heat. About 6 months after that night, a small insured package arrived at my apartment. There was no return address, but the postmark was from Greenwich. Inside, nestled in a worn dark blue velvet box, was the Cartier watch, the family heirloom, the one my mother had pointedly given to Claire at Christmas years ago as a symbol of her place in the family's legacy. There was no note, no card, no explanation, just the watch, its gold face gleaming under my apartment's cheap fluorescent lights. It was a treaty offering, a white flag, a bribe. It was an attempt to speak to me in the only language they truly understood, money and status. I closed the lid, slid the box into the back of a desk drawer and never opened it again. I never went back to that house. My family and I exist in the same world, but in different universes now. Ethan and Claire did divorce. He re-enlisted for active duty, and I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he seemed happier, more himself than he had in years. The great Thompson dynasty my father was so obsessed with building ended with a silent dinner and a slammed door. The reversal wasn't about me winning and them losing. It was never a game. It was simply about the truth finally finding its own voice, and when it spoke, it was so clear and so absolute that it needed no further argument from me. It just was. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-confidence, please share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening. Looking back, the biggest lesson I learned wasn't about family or betrayal, but about value. For years, I had been letting my family hold the scale, letting them weigh my life against their standards of success, and always coming up short. I was so focused on the injustice of their judgment that I didn't realize I was participating in it by even caring what they thought. That night, I finally understood that my worth wasn't something they could grant or take away. It wasn't a stock they could trade or a title they could bestow. It was something I had been building quietly in the dark, far away from their world of polished surfaces and hollow praise. The real battle wasn't against them. It was against the voice in my own head that still, after all this time, sought their approval. Their world is a beautiful, gilded cage. It's built on the illusion that what people see is all that matters. The right car, the right address, the right last name, these are the pillars of their reality. And for a long time I thought my problem was that I didn't fit inside that cage. But the truth is, the cage was never meant for me. My path was always outside of it, in a world where honor, duty, and commitment are the real currency. The most profound shift for me was realizing that their dismissal of my life wasn't a judgment on my failure, but a reflection of their own limitations. They couldn't see my world, not because it was small, but because their own was too narrow to contain it. Their values were a map to a place I had no desire to go. What I learned in that moment of searing humiliation and in the silence that followed was that you don't have to win the argument to win your freedom. I didn't need to shout my accomplishments from the rooftops or list my credentials. The truth, I discovered, has its own weight and its own voice. My silence that night wasn't an act of submission. It was an act of supreme confidence. I knew what was coming. I knew my life didn't need a defense attorney. It just needed to be seen. And when it was, it spoke for itself far more powerfully than any angry words I could have mustered. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let the truth walk into the room on its own 2 feet and just stand there. This brings me to the idea of respect. In my family's circle, respect is transactional. It's given in exchange for power, wealth, or influence. It's a performance, a social contract. But the respect Ethan showed me that night was something else entirely. It wasn't for sale. It couldn't be inherited or negotiated in a boardroom. It was earned. It was forged in shared principles, in discipline, and in a quiet understanding of what it means to serve something larger than yourself. That single silent gesture of his was worth more than my father's entire fortune because it was real. It was a reminder that the world has a different, more meaningful scoreboard than the one my family was keeping. Many of us wear 2 uniforms. There's the one we wear for the world or for our families, the costume that helps us fit in or at least go unnoticed. And then there's the one we wear in secret. It's the uniform that represents who we really are, what we're truly passionate about, the person we are when no one is watching or judging. I hid my uniform for years because I was afraid it wasn't shiny enough for them. I was afraid they would tarnish it with their disapproval. But what I learned is that you can't live a full life in a costume. Your real strength, your real honor, is in the uniform you've earned for yourself. And you should never be ashamed to wear it. Ultimately, the greatest freedom you can ever give yourself is the freedom from the opinions of others, especially when those others are supposed to love you the most. Walking out of that house wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of liberation. I was no longer a son seeking approval or a brother trying to measure up. I was just a man, secure in his own skin, walking his own path. The peace that comes from that kind of self-acceptance is unshakable. It's a foundation you build for yourself brick by brick, far away from the judging eyes of the world. Your life is your story, and you are the only one who gets to decide if it's a success. If you've ever felt like you were living in someone else's shadow, or fighting to be seen for who you truly are, I hope my story reminds you of your own strength. Your value is not up for debate. Please share this with anyone who might need to hear that message. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about forging your own identity and finding the courage to live it. Thank you for being here with me.